Thanks for joining us for today's conversation. Thanks in advance to our speakers. I too live on the ancestral homelands of Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples and other indigenous tribes that call Boulder, Colorado their home, and benefit greatly from their contemporary and ancestral stewardship of these lands. And so that's where I'm at today. I think other people are sharing that from the chat as well. I am one of the co-chairs of the IARC Observing Community of Practice, along with Lauren Culler, my co-chair, who's here with us today. I'm going to be our on-point host for this meeting, but Lauren is certainly the co-host in every way. And so I just want to give everybody a brief the highlights of the agenda and kind of help stitch this together. So our community of practice, we've spent a lot of our time in this space looking at more of the kind of high level planning and integration mechanisms that inform the observing and data systems of the Arctic region. And so this meeting is exemplary of that. We're going to be looking at the upcoming Arctic Observing Summit, which happens every 2 years. It's taking place in Edinburgh, Scotland, but there's also a virtual participation option, which is not at a great time if you live in Alaska, but the option exists. And so it's a unique structure for a meeting. And so we thought it would be valuable for people who are participating maybe for the first time to hear about that unique structure and kind of map out their own ideas about how to best engage in the meeting. And also there's some US-led efforts that are going to be really well integrated into that meeting. And so you'll have an opportunity to hear about those efforts and maybe think about, if you're not going to the meeting, how you could plug into those efforts here at home. And so our first speaker is going to be Alice Bradley from Williams College. And then I'll just introduce the other speakers and their topics as they come up. Alice is going to lead us as one of the co-chairs of the meeting of the Arctic Observing Summit. She's going to lead us through an overview and a synopsis. So Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandy. Yes, as Sandy said, I'm Alice Bradley. I'm faculty at Williams College in Western Massachusetts. And then I am also one of the co-chairs of the Arctic Observing Summit. And so this year's AOS will be in Edinburgh in Scotland. We have a delightful venue in which half of the meeting is taking part in what looks like a castle. So I think it should be a great week at the end of March. The Arctic Observing Summit is an activity of 2 organizations, SAON, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, and IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee. Many of you guys will be familiar with these organizations, but the really important difference about the AOS is that it's very grassroots and very small d democratic. So where SAON and IASC, most of the representation there comes from national delegations, where you have to be nominated or appointed to one of these organizations, one of these committees. The AOS is really meant to be an open and inclusive community. So we aim to be a platform for discussion, bringing people together with perspectives across national, across operational and research boundaries, and to center Indigenous perspectives in conversations around Arctic observing. And so where these more formal structures can influence and advise the broader Arctic observing system and different kind of decision-making entities, the AOS kind of stands alongside our partner organizations in saying, okay, here's input that's coming straight from the people doing the work in this area. So I don't necessarily need to go through all of our goals as a summit, but really the idea behind this meeting is that it's bringing people and bringing ideas together rather than doing some sort of top-down or very formal structure. So how that works is a process. So before the summit, we have wide calls for input. This includes soliciting short statements. These are usually on the order of 1 to 4 pages on different perspectives and ideas related to observing in the Arctic. And so I'll come back to talking about some of the short statements submitted to this year's summit. But then much of the work prior to the summit happens at the scale of the working groups. So these are loosely organized groups organizing the discussion sessions at the summit around particular topics and big questions, kind of big issues coming up in Arctic observing. And this pre-summit work really focuses on planning the agenda for the discussions and then taking that input from the short statements and integrating it into our plan for conversation. So during the summit, most of the time at AOS is spent having conversations. There are very few speakers, there are very few keynote or other presentation slots, and really what we're looking for is active conversation, taking advantage of the fact that we've got a couple hundred bright minds in a room all working together and have that opportunity to exchange ideas and come up with good ideas for how to move Arctic observing forward. And so these different working groups and other sessions will meet during the summit, have discussions, kind of generate ideas and recommendations for how best to move forward. And then those recommendations we pull together after the summit compile into reports, brief statements, various formats that then go to various bodies. So this can be the Arctic Science Ministerial meetings. This can be different funding agencies. We often will have a lot of recommendations that then go back to SAN or go to other Arctic observing organizations in how to move things forward. And the kind of workhorses of the Arctic Observing Summit then are these working groups. So over the slightly more than 10 years now the summit has been going, the different working groups changed a little bit from time to time, but we kind of have some themes that carry through. One of the big ones is scaling between kind of local or regional scale observing networks and then these big global systems, whether that's the Global Climate Observing System, Global Ocean Observing System, or this year's particular interest is looking at the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, so one of the Arctic Council working groups, and how we scale from local to regional in that sense, and then up to global biodiversity monitoring. We have working groups focused in data sharing, in observing for kind of regional scale adaptation and benefits, and then in implementation of the SAN roads process. So at the summit, we have a combination of plenary sessions, and by plenary sessions, I mean, or a combination, I mean very few of them, where we have everyone in one room, but we do have a few keynote talks. One particular one that I'd like to highlight, and which has really emerged as a theme, is this summit is thinking about what equity means in the context of Arctic observing. Where are the systemic hurdles, kind of where are there opportunities and approaches towards achieving equity in international Arctic observing efforts, really focusing on Indigenous inclusion. The other thing that happens in the plenary sessions is reporting back from these different breakout sessions. In the process of getting and generating these kind of lists of recommendations all happen in these plenaries. And then most of our time are in breakout sessions. We have a whole bunch of kind of one or two block sessions this year. Again, these slides are all up on the IARC website, so you can take a look at the different sessions there, and then also at the Arctic Observing Summit website. But these are really where the working groups or the different sessions meet to generate, to discuss these different topics, come up with ideas and recommendations to move forward. And over the 10 years of doing this, we've had a lot of practice and really been able to hone in on the most useful ways, the most kind of useful framing of different recommendations that really focuses on both on kind of all pieces of the who, what, when, how, and why. And so over the years, over the different summits, as a group, we've kind of gotten more effective at making things happen. So again, most of this is happening in our 4 working groups, but we also have these 8 other sessions happening around the summit. And then all of this information kind of we bring it back together in the plenary sessions at the end, and then pull together into the various reports. So there'll be a big conference statement that comes together, and then more customized versions that go out to different organizations and different perspectives that might need this information. So as we've been pulling together the 2024 AOS, there's been a handful of themes that have really emerged. Equity and Arctic observing is a big one. So I've got some kind of highlights from our agenda here, with breakout sessions, activities of different working groups, and some of the short statements, in addition to our keynote. Indigenous-led observing is a major interest. Societal benefit analysis, we have a whole afternoon focused on this topic, along with work in one of the working groups that Margaret will talk about more later. This question of kind of what observing resources exist, kind of where do we already have capacity? There's some great short statements and some really relevant breakout sessions and work with the data sharing working group. Questions around risk assessment come up in many of the short statements and in some of the breakout sessions. And then the last kind of big theme is looking towards the next steps in the roads process. And that, again, is showing up across multiple working groups, across many of our short statements and breakout sessions. So again, I highly recommend taking a look at the AOS website. We have a preliminary agenda that's up there, but has all of these sessions listed. There'll be a more detailed version posted early next week, along with all of the short statements should be available by no later than Friday. I have confirmation from the web team at Calgary that their interface is back to working. So those should be up very soon. You're welcome to contact me if you have any questions after the meeting. And then to register for the summit for in-person participation, the deadline is March 7th. And then for online participation, register by March 18th. And the registration is through the Arctic Science Summit Week at ASSW.info. And I think I managed to stay on time.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Alice. And that was a great synthesis of what you've seen in the short statement so far. It was exciting to see that laid out that way. We're going to hold questions until the end. And so we've left time for discussion. Our next speaker is going to be Margaret Rudolf, who's joining us from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And she is going to be speaking about the Indigenous leadership engagement and representation across the AOS, and the specifics of the working group on implementation.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. So in the past AOS, we've had really great Indigenous leadership, especially within such as the Food Security Working Group. This AOS, we really wanted to focus on kind of moving past the recommendations, in the sense of we have so many good recommendations, and last AOS it did feel a bit repetitive, and so we really wanted to have now start thinking about how we implement those recommendations and really focusing on inclusion, Indigenous representation within much of the discussions happening at AOS, instead of it being a bit separate. And so we got Indigenous co-chairs for all of the working groups. We really encourage breakout sessions with Indigenous presenters and on topics that are relevant for Indigenous people. We have, as Alice mentioned, we have 2 Indigenous speakers on the Equity and Observing plenary. And then we have a lot of topics, again, that are really relevant to Indigenous people, as well as a lot of these have Indigenous representation in their dialogue as co-chairs or speakers. Working Group 1 is looking at CAF CBMP. Working Group 2 has a session discussing Indigenous data sovereignty. Working Group 3 is really focused on having dialogue around developing expert panels with Indigenous communities and how do you go about doing that. Working Group 4, again, is all about benefit and adaptation. And then we have a lot of breakout sessions from community-based monitoring, low cost and open source technology, wheel building, inclusion of diverse knowledge systems, capacity sharing, and impact assessments. And so there's definitely, I saw a lot of folks online who are helping with this. And so thank you so much for participating and supporting this to happen. I wanted to give an example of one of the working groups and how they're operating. I am co-chairing working group 3, which is system implementation, which is really on the dialogue on partnership development with Arctic Indigenous communities. And this is in the context of SAN's Arctic Roads, which SAN is sustaining Arctic observing networks, and Roads is Roadmap for Arctic Observing and Data Systems. It's a pan-Arctic initiative. Yeah, it's just in the context, but we're hoping that the dialogue, you don't have to be an expert in roads to have the dialogue is our goal and how we're framing our discussions. And it's really about the specific topic under that partnership development is grounding in societal benefit and impacts of observing the data systems. The topics we'll be discussing is how to do co-develop benefit and impact assessments with Arctic Indigenous communities, discussion of the potential methods and frameworks to those assessments, Indigenous, scientific, co-production knowledge type discussions. And how do you then, from really grounding yourself in what is relevant to Arctic Indigenous communities, how do you then co-develop observables with those assessments? And then here's the breakout. Each working group has 4 sessions. So our first session will be an overview, framing of the dialogue, and just kind of broad discussion about this topic. And then the second session we'll do a mock expert panel related to salmon and have a dialogue, just so we have these discussions, not just in the abstract, but in context of an example. And Harmony will speak more on that. And then on Friday, we have 2 sessions. One, we'll be talking about, okay, you have the assessment, then how would you go about evaluating it in an appropriate way in thinking about the different perspectives of success. And then the last session, which is general for all the working groups, you start developing recommendations and next steps for this work. And so with that, I will hand it off to Harmony.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harmony Weiner, and I'm an Indigenous liaison at the International Arctic Research Center in Fairbanks. And I'm on the team with Margaret on the Research Networking and Activities Project. So I just wanted to report out on some of the work that we've been doing here in Alaska. And so we had a workshop at the Alaska Forum on the Environment on February 9th. And so we were doing this kind of mock expert panel process and framing the project first through a panel of experts that some are on the line, like Roberta Glenn here, of the work that's being done across the state and across the Arctic, and also with international partners on kind of bringing this into context of how do we create research questions with equity in mind, and also coming together on specific topic areas. So we had breakout sessions on salmon, wildfire, harmful algal blooms, permafrost, and coastal erosion. And this was through what you can see on the smaller slide picture, which is starting with why and grounding in community needs. So with salmon, we can go to the next slide. One more. Okay. Oh, wait, back one. Okay. So with salmon, the why was how do we integrate community well-being into what the research questions are asking. So how do we merge like societal needs with the management decisions that are going on? So grounding the question in the well-being of users, and then what, so information needs, what kind of things do we need to observe? What are the data gaps? And so part of the project is building an info portal off the State of Alaska Salmon and People. So combining data sets and how to make more accessible data around a specific resource like salmon. And then who do we need to bring to the table? And so making groups at this Alaska Forum on the Environment session and having feedback from a lot of different user groups, state agencies, federal agencies, community members, and everyone with different perspectives on how we can best serve the community around salmon. And then how make sure this is equitable, funding is in place, and how it can be done in practice. So this is a 3-year long project, standing up the expert panel, kicking off with the Arctic Observing Summit and the mock expert panel that will be part of Working Group 3 that is on the 28th, if I'm not mistaken, in Margaret's previous diagram. So if you're there, it'd be really great to have you in that session, especially if you have some input on salmon. We can move on. I think this was Hajo, but I can also take the slide as well.
Please.
Okay.
If you could chat. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so right now in the spring, we have the initial group of the expert panel that is kind of framing the scope, and then recruiting for the 10 to 12 person bigger panel. And so the AOS will kind of be at more of a working session to frame how we want to move forward, and what our goals are, being grounded in the well-being framework that was presented in the last figure by Donkersloot et al. 2020. But how do we do that in practice with everyone's different expertise? And so the summer will take a break, and then fall, winter, we'll keep working on the why and potential benefits, and then presenting again at AFE 2025 to see where we're at then. And so kind of moving forward with recommendations of where funding needs to go, and who else we need to bring to the table. And so then in AOS 2026 will be more of the final presentation of the project, where we'll present what the findings are in terms of what needs to be observed in the salmon ecosystem, and how can we bring together the data to do it right, and the people. Yeah, next.
Great. Harmony, are we transitioning to Hajo here?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
wanted
Thanks so much for all of that.
If I could add real quick, just so there's no confusion. So in Working Group 3, it's a mock salmon expert panel, because it's not actually the salmon expert panel Harmony is working on. Just to be clear, but it's Harmony is providing the case example.
Great, thanks, Margaret. And then Hajo, also of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, is going to wrap up our presentations before we transition to discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm Hajo Eicken with International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks on the Trophiada campus here. I just wanted to give a perspective on the international dimensions of the Arctic Observing Summit, and how those of you who are interested in particular in that aspect can get involved, and where things currently stand. Just a brief perspective on this project that we're all part of, that I'm helping lead, supported through the National Science Foundation, the research networking activity that is meant to support the Say on Roads process, the Arctic Roadmap for observing and data systems. And I also want to highlight in-kind support and additional funding that we've received from NOAA. So very grateful for that support. This research networking activity is an open network, so any of those here on the call, or if you're listening to this later on in the recorded version, please reach out to us. You have our website with contact information here at the start of the presentation if you want to be involved in any way. We're sponsoring, as part of our work, participation in the Arctic Observing Summit for a number of participants, many of them Indigenous participants. And so there's other opportunities as well that you can get involved. I will focus, so we have a set of 4 groups of tasks under this project. I want to focus on the international component of the networking and partnerships piece here in the left. And the next slide then gives you a bit of a lay of the land for the Arctic Observing Summit here, as well as our project in terms of the different components that touch on the Observing Summit itself. One great aspect of the summit is that it's a bottom-up activity, but it has a lot of connectors, boundary spanners involved. So it's a really good opportunity also for early career scientists to connect with others in the field at various levels of in terms of their role in the process. So I just wanted to highlight two examples related to Working Group 1. That is the local to global observing. Margaret already mentioned this. This is co-led. Sorry, Margaret, if you could just stick with the previous slide for a minute. I did want to kind of make a few pointers here. So Working Group 1 is grappling with a very significant challenge. But as co-lead, Victoria Bushman, who is with a senior advisor with Inuit Circumpolar Council Greenland, is really well positioned to help the group in terms of making these connections. And I wanted to point to the box at the very bottom right, the Global Observing Coordination. The Global Ocean Observing System, or GOOS, has had over a number of years now conversations around how they can engage with the Arctic research community, as well as with Indigenous rights holders and Indigenous experts in the Arctic. A lot of that connecting has been facilitated by the Arctic Observing Summit. And this summit is really where there's going to be more substantive conversations, including as part of Working Group 1, of how to connect these global scale observations to local scale and regional observations. And there it's meaningful, as you already heard earlier, that the Arctic Council's Conservation of Arctic Fauna and Flora, or CAF, working group, you see that here in the box above, and in particular the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, are very much part of these conversations. Victoria has been very engaged in this conversation, and we're hoping that that presents an opportunity also to then get further down to the local scale that you see represented here at the top left, community-centered observing. I just want to call it the Indigenous Sentinels Network, led by the Aleut community of St. Paul. There's strong participation by that group. You saw Hannah Helen, who's working with them, who's part of the workshop in Anchorage here a few weeks back. So a lot of the summit work is about making connections between these different scales. And so the next slide then gives you a bit more of a sort of scientific observation location perspective. This is an analysis that Ann Nguyen with the University of Texas, who's also part of this effort and who led one of the equity-focused brief statements for the summit and is helping organize equity-focused session, a plenary session at the summit, put together. This is an analysis of the state of the Arctic Ocean in terms of temperature, salinity, some of the core state variables based on available data from a research perspective now. And if you advance one step, we'll look at the Pacific Arctic sector here in a bit more detail from the same graphic. So these are all the observations that went into this analysis conducted by Dr. Nguyen. And you'll notice that in those areas in particular where we've seen major changes, Bering Sea, big changes in the sea ice cover impacts and potential transitions of the marine ecosystem, very big impacts on marine living species, in particular the salmon, that directly tie into Alaska Native Indigenous, both subsistence harvests, commercial harvests, the cultural significance of the salmon, and the fact that for the past 3 years, no harvests were possible on the Yukon River all the way up into First Nations lands in Canada. That area in this analysis is not covered very well, and it's exactly the type of conversations at the summit that are trying to dig a bit deeper as to what is missing here, what is needed. Some of this is more a question of data portals and data availability or data sharing. So that's something that Matt Jones, who's leading the data portal team here for our RNA project, is going to be working on. And I just want to emphasize in particular that this is a very international aspect here. A lot of the salmon that are congregating in the Bering Sea come from Russia and Asia. So we're very much focused on bringing Asian colleagues into this work as well. And in that context, just one item to illustrate again the conversations here on the next slide. You'll see if you're already familiar with this, there's the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement that is playing a more important role in terms of both relating to societal benefits of sustained observations as well as an international framework. Victoria Bushman and specifically the Inuit Circumpolar Council and particular Inuit Circumpolar Council Greenland are very much involved in conversations about the treaty role that Indigenous bodies and organizations have in the context of this agreement. And the next slide gives you an example also of the conversations that are important now from an observing perspective and the opportunities. This here is a conceptual diagram of a new research icebreaker that Japan is building. The vessel is expected to start operations mostly in the Pacific Arctic sector in 2027. And Japan has made it very clear that they see this vessel as a platform for international collaboration, including, international now in the context of having Indigenous nations here be part of the conversation. They hosted a workshop in November last year on this topic. And the summit is a great space to bring together people who are interested in technology, interested in long-term planning, international collaboration, to think more about how sustained observations and frameworks for observations, such as what's being discussed in the different working groups, can form the foundation for more deliberate thinking about how research vessels like this can generate, as part of their core infrastructure, observations that are beneficial to Indigenous peoples, communities in the Arctic region. The next slide gives a brief illustration of that. The question is how such research vessel supported coordinated or sustained observing activities can provide benefits from the local to the regional to the pan-Arctic or global scale. And I just want to highlight here that Japan is doing quite a bit of work, some of it in collaboration with NOAA on how to improve observations of weather, extreme weather, ice conditions from these vessels. That's a great opportunity now to have conversations around these types of observations. Another example in the next slide that I wanted to highlight, which again relates back to some of these expert panels that are being stood up. What's shown here is an example from a Woods Hole cruise on the Sikuliaq, the University of Alaska operated NSF-supported research vessel a couple of years ago, where last year, in fact, observations made from the vessel with an automated sensor system were able to provide important information on harmful algal blooms to communities in the region. And in particular, Lauren Devine with Aleut Community of St. Paul, who's also playing an important role in the planning of the Arctic Observing Summit and the Say on Roads process, has really been leading some of these connections here. So looking at the summit as an opportunity to try to connect different programs, different initiatives, and be more forward-thinking in terms of how we collaborate on these efforts, in particular from an Alaska perspective, of course, focus on the Pacific Arctic is an important opportunity. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much for that. That felt like a great pep talk for this meeting. There's so many interesting things going on. And so we've left a good amount of time for discussion. Thanks to everybody for collectively keeping to time. And I think, Hazel, if you're ready, what we thought we would do just to get the wheels in your head turning is just to put up a short poll reminding you that there's these working group tracks that Alice described. That is one, sticking to a track is one way to participate in the summit, but also mixing it up and not being sure is a good way to participate in the summit. So we're just going to flash up a quick poll. And so there's two different questions. So the first question is, which track are you planning to join? during the summit, and you can see the options there. There was the local to global observing working group, data sharing, systems implementation, et cetera. And then just for our benefit, for Lauren and I to know if this meeting was useful to you after the summit, would it be good to have another discussion like this? Or would you rather just review materials or find some other way to engage? So please respond to the poll, and then we'll jump into our discussion.
And just to reiterate, all of the working groups are absolutely open to anyone who wants to join at any point during the summit. This is very much an ongoing welcome to the tent kind of thing. There's no prior anything required to participate. Although
And
I will say
it's a very inclusive group. Like, yeah, they want different ideas and things like that.
And many of the working groups do make, some short statements, some resources available if you want to catch up on discussions and have some more background information. And we'll make sure that that's all readily available on the website very soon.
Great, thanks for that. And yeah, for sure, we're not going to hold anybody to what they say. We're just trying to get a flavor of it. And no, we cannot see the results, Hazel.
Interesting. We're having a few more folks answer. I think I have to end the poll before you'll be able to see them. So last 10 seconds. Okay, that's looking pretty steady. I will and go ahead and share. Can you see them now?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. And I wasn't able to answer the poll because I'm the host, but I am going to the Observing System Benefits group. So
Well, I was just thinking they might need to do more marketing based on that. Okay, great. That was useful. Thank you for playing along. And it also looks like there'd be some interest in a circling back and doing another discussion like this. So it's useful for us to know for planning for our community of practice. But please, through using your raise hand or comment in the chat, or if you are the type to just want to come off mute and speak, ask questions of our speakers.
Yep, David has his hand raised. David Allen.
Thanks, Lauren. How's it going, folks? Thanks so much for putting this on. I think this is really, really valuable. I've only participated in these summits virtually since the pandemic, so this is really, really valuable to get a sort of primer. Since you, I'll bite on your last comment and the 0% in the observing for adaptation and benefit. We have an ongoing discussion in my office at NOAA about how to value the observing system, and I'm wondering is that the discussion that's going to happen in that track 4? Thanks.
Yeah, so I can sort of talk to this being not directly in that working group. So that working group is looking a little bit more in the kind of mid-level discussion and thinking about, okay, where are there maybe financial benefits? Where are there different kinds of economic benefits related to different observing? Where are there, emergency response, these kind of things? Looking more at the kind of broader perspective. That's where the session that Sandy and Margaret are running on, I guess it's Thursday afternoon of the AOS, really looking at system or benefits assessment methods. I think that's going to be a really key place. And then also working group 3, if Margaret wants to say anything else about it, is going to have some really interesting content related to that. All of these working groups is going to have some very overlapping and intertwined kind of conversations. And that's why we make sure that everyone is in or as many people as we can get are in one place for these conversations.
Yeah, there's several sessions. I don't know, Sandy, if you had that slide that you were working on, if that's ready to show.
Yeah, I could share that.
But definitely working group 3 is all about that. How do we assess and then two, once you have the assessment, how do you evaluate the assessment?
This is the slide that Margaret was talking about. So this discussion is, or this slide is looking at the different aspects of the summit that are going to be speaking to defining and assessing impactful observations. And the working group on benefit and adaptation, we still, I think, need to have more interaction with them about what their plans for the session are to understand, because I think it would be good to have them on here too. I think this is a good confusion to clarify ahead of the summit. And I think it showed up in the poll a little bit. And I think David's question's a great one, that people might just need a little bit more context to understand the specifics. David, did we get there? And also, since Hazel's a little bit involved in that group, Hazel, if you want to share anything that you're aware of that group's going to be doing, it would be useful.
I have been hearing a little bit of what they're doing, but I haven't actually joined any of their meetings, and I'm planning on doing that this week. So I'll join the last two of those. So unfortunately, I don't really feel like I have the chops to speak to that without having talked with them directly. But happy to be a connection point if folks want to reach out to me, and I can connect you with the folks who are organizing that group if you have more questions there.
There is the program that is currently on the iOS website has some description for each of the working groups, and we will have a more updated one with a little bit more information that should be posted beginning of next week. So there will be more information coming. I just don't necessarily have it yet on that particular group.
Great, thank you. Other questions for the speakers, or did anybody submit a short statement that they'd like to talk about if we haven't talked about it yet? Yep, David.
Sign me up. Okay. So I just wanted to say, regardless of what group you're actually involved in, I'll put in a plug for speaking to Hajo's comments earlier on. Please come into the session. It's a 4-hour session, so maybe you can choose which one you actually go to. But there is a session on the Goose establishing a Goose Regional Alliance for the Arctic, and the way that these activities are the most valuable to the community is if we actually hear from and have regular participation from the community. I just encourage folks to actually participate in that. And now to follow with an actual question, I'll say, what are, as organizers, what are you looking forward to most as outcomes from the meeting? Thanks.
I may have outed myself in the chat by calling Margaret's working group my favorite working group, but at the last summit, the amount of progress that happened around the roads process and really putting a lot of brains onto, how do we move this forward in an efficient manner? What do we need to consider? The amount that can get done in 2.5 or 3 days, if you put your minds to it, is really incredible. So I'm excited to see what comes out of the Sand Roads implementation working group, but then also all of the other working groups. It's kind of amazing what happens over the course of 72 hours. Especially when I then have to write the reports about it.
I think the real struggle as organizers is that I'm set to lead a couple things, but I'm like, but I want to attend that session, that one. And so I think it's definitely, there's going to be a lot of great things happening.
Yeah, Hajo.
Yeah, thanks, David, for bringing that up. I really have high hopes, but also recognize that it's difficult work for this connection between local, regional, and global observing efforts. That continues to be one of the major challenges. And my sense is that right now we're in a spot where, or in a place where people like Victoria Bushman, who's thought about this from the perspective of circumpolar biodiversity monitoring, indigenous-led conservation perspectives. So there's a lot of different people there. Others include people who've been really pushing on the Global Ocean Observing System to be more connected with the Arctic. Craig Lee, Jari Hapala from the Finnish Met Institute, and others. So in my mind, there's a lot of really great contributors that are going to be part of the meeting, but at the same time, there's also the frameworks that you need to actually make progress. Where again, I see the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, while it is, fisheries is in the title, but at the same time, it's ultimately really about large-scale climate, marine ecosystem shifts and their impacts on both indigenous peoples of the Arctic and in a global context. These are globally important fisheries. And so that combination is something that's really both important, challenging to work through, but also holds a lot of promise. So hopefully that's where, after the summit, it'll be much clearer how to collaborate on some of these issues and then get buy-in the different countries at the higher political level to actually put things in place that are going to make a difference.
Great, thanks for that, Hajo. Further thoughts? We haven't heard much about the data working group today, but it did look like a couple people responding to the poll did mention that they're going to be showing up at the data working group. Does anybody want to speak to what they're hoping for or expecting from that group?
Sandy, I can speak briefly to at least part of it. Oh, sorry, I see Allison's hand was raised too, but I'll just speak to the Indigenous data sovereignty component of that working group. So we have several themes we'll be discussing, and we have 2 discussions that will be focusing on Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think one of them will be sort of more broad and looking at capacity sharing and Indigenous data sovereignty and how it relates to data sharing. And that's going to be the first session. So we'll be inviting people into kind of a framing around what is Indigenous data sovereignty, what's been discussed at previous Arctic observing summits. And then for the second session, it'll be more technically focused. So we'll have a nice panel of different programs who've worked on thinking about interoperability and data sharing when Indigenous data is part of the data that's being shared. And so thinking about some of those questions, but from more of a technical angle. So I think those will be two sub pieces of that data sharing session. I don't know if anyone can speak to some of the other themes that we've been discussing as well.
Great, thanks for that, Noor. Allison, and then if anybody else wants to speak to the other themes after Allison, please.
I'm sure. Hi, I'm going to be attending and participating on behalf of the Arctic Observing Viewer Development, but also the statement that we put in for building a polar observing registry of observing assets. And I'm looking forward to discussions about the progress that have been made towards interoperability and just some recent developments. So yeah, I'll be in that group.
I can say very quickly that the topics for the data system or data sharing working group. So as Noor said, we have the Indigenous data sovereignty. First piece is capacity sharing. Second is technical capacities. third kind of session block is looking at integration with the roads process and kind of what data systems and what adaptation needs to happen to make that work. And then the fourth piece is data interoperability. So again, all of that will be in the updated agenda that'll be out early next week, and we'll make sure to share it to IARC as well.
Awesome, thank you. Well, it's a good thing that so much of the session focuses on reporting back from these groups, because they are all individually so interesting that it's hard to choose for sure. And so all of the people who are still undecided, you have my sympathy.
After the summit last year, we ended up with I think 105 pages of notes that then turned into the 6-page conference statement. So to get a sense of how much is happening at this meeting.
Lauren.
Yeah, I am also new to the Arctic Observing Summit, and I also know that at Arctic Science Summit Week, there are a lot of events before the Arctic Observing Summit focused on observing. And so I was wondering if anyone here can kind of flag some of those important other discussions that are happening that might feed into what's talked about during the 3 days of the summit.
I can rattle off a few off the top of my head, and then that's a great question. And then if others have some they want to add, please do. So there's going to be what we call an open partnership meeting about the roads process, where the advisory panel for the roads process invites in everyone who's piloting the process and people who are curious about the process and thinking about it, for a pretty, it's a structured discussion, but it's an opportunity for the advisory panel to hear from everybody about basically how's it going and what can we adapt and adjust. There is going to be a Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks board meeting. SAN has not met in person since the Arctic Council pause, and that is going to be, I think, also an open meeting. And then I'm blanking on the, oh yes, and then Hazel is going to be leading on behalf of the U.S. Arctic Observing Network a session to train people in the processes of our benefit assessment tool. So there's a few. And Noor.
Yeah, I just had one question. I see we're almost at time here, but you mentioned the statement that is developed, and the magic of taking 500 pages and turning it into a 3-page statement. I was wondering if you, Alice, or others who've been involved, Hajo, can just talk about that process a little bit. Like, how does that happen? How does that magic happen? Who's involved?
So a lot of it comes from the working group chairs, and in many of the breakout sessions, kind of part of the discussion is, okay, what are the pieces that we need to highlight? And again, it's trying to fill in as many of the blanks in the who, what, when, where, how, and sometimes with what money piece of these different recommendations. And so we pull them all together into a document. Usually there'll be a long version and then a short version and then an extra short version. And then if there are, an Arctic Science Ministerial happening or something that we need to spin off a slightly modified or slightly more targeted version, we'll do that as well. But usually that will be a combination of the working group chairs, any session chairs, and then the organizing committee. But Hajo's done more of them than I have, so if he wants to add.
Hajo.
No, that was great. The only other thing I would point to is that we are at a point where France just hosted sort of what may have been an equivalent of an Arctic Science Ministerial, but really wasn't. The connection between the Arctic Observing Summit, which provides direct input to the Arctic Science Ministerial, has been important in getting actual processes underway. Japan, for example, as a country, has really taken that input seriously, which is why you see their research vessel now established as a platform for international collaboration. And so those of you who are moving in those circles, or us more broadly as a community, getting a way to kind of see where's the Arctic Science Ministerial process with new chairmanship of the Arctic Council now is going to be an important component here of the work.
Great, thank you for that. And
I
the
also-
comment, oh, sorry, I just wanted to point to the comment from Cindy in the chat, and then Margaret, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to pitch ICARP, the International Conference on Arctic Research Planning. It's a 10-year pan-Arctic planning process. And I am co-chairing Research Party Topic 2 related to observing. And we have an open session all day on Monday.
Awesome. Well, so we are at time, and one thing I would very much encourage is if you're new to the summit and you're feeling shy, feel free to send me an email or any of the people, any of the speakers you heard from to meet for a coffee or to come check out your poster. If there's anybody on this call you want to meet, let's just use this as an opportunity to all get to know each other better and support each other through the meeting, because there's going to be a lot going on. And anybody I haven't met in person, I'm really looking forward to seeing you and meeting you in person for the first time. Lauren, closing.
I just want to thank everybody for being here, and thanks to our presenters for giving everyone such a great overview. Really excited for the summit. So thank you all.
All right. Great. Well, hope to see you all soon. Thanks for your participation today. And yes, thanks to the speakers again.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone, and see many of you
Thanks,
soon.
everyone. Have a great one.